Chapter 12 The Rush to the Bering Sea, 1898 to 1900. The discovery at Cape Nome, a new El Dorado in the Arctic. As the 19th century drew to a close, the world believed the era of the great individual finds had ended with the Klondike. However, in the summer of 1898, a discovery was made that defied all geological precedent and reignited the dying embers of gold fever. Three men, known to history as the three Lucky Swedes, Eric Lindblom, Japhet Lindeberg, and John Bryntesen, struck a massive deposit of gold on Anvil Creek, near the desolate Cape Nome on the edge of the Bering Sea. But the true miracle occurred a year later when it was discovered that the very sands of the Bering Sea beaches were saturated with fine, flour-like gold. This was a new El Dorado where the treasure was not hidden in deep mountain veins but lay exposed on the shoreline, washed by the icy Arctic surf. The news of the beach gold at Nome triggered a psychological explosion. Unlike the Klondike, which required a grueling trek over the Chilkoot Pass, Nome was accessible by sea. The prospect of simply landing on a beach and shoveling gold into a bucket was an intoxicating siren song that reached the ears of the world's restless. The environment, however, was a nightmare of Arctic desolation. Cape Nome was a treeless, wind-scourged tundra where the ground remained frozen in permafrost for most of the year. The Bering Sea itself was a chaotic barrier of shifting ice flows and violent storms, making the region unreachable for 8 months of the year. The discovery at Cape Nome was a geological anomaly that challenged the assayer's eye. The gold was not the result of recent erosion, but had been deposited there by ancient glaciers and the relentless pounding of the sea over millennia. The Nome discovery provided a crucial late-century injection of bullion into the global economy, just as the world was formalizing its commitment to the gold standard. It was a poor man's paradise born in a rich man's climate, a place where the binary between survival and fortune was separated only by a few inches of frozen sand. The Bering Sea, once a silent frontier of whalers and indigenous hunters, was about to become the stage for the last great theatrical act of the 19th century gold seeker. 2. The Stampede of 18,000, comparing Nome to the Klondike. By the spring of 1900, the Nome excitement had transformed from a distant rumor into a full-scale maritime invasion. While the Klondike rush of 1897 was a saga of mountainous agony requiring men to carry tons of supplies over the treacherous Chilkoot Pass, the stampede to Nome was a spectacle of industrial-age mobility. It was dubbed the poor man's rush because for the price of a steamship ticket, a clerk from Seattle could be deposited directly onto the golden sands of the Bering Sea. In a single frantic season, over 18,000 people descended upon a coastline that months earlier had been home to a few dozen souls. The contrast between Nome and the Klondike was not merely geographical, but legal and social. In the Canadian Klondike, the Northwest Mounted Police had maintained a stern British order. You could not enter without a year's supply of food, and the law was absolute. Nome, however, was in the District of Alaska, a territory governed by vague American laws and overseen by a skeletal, often corrupt administration. This lack of oversight, combined with the sheer density of the crowd, 18,000 people crammed onto a narrow strip of beach, created a chaotic tent city that stretched for miles. While the Klondike was a test of physical endurance, Nome was a test of social survival. The sheer scale of the 1900 stampede overwhelmed the Arctic's fragile capacity to sustain life. Unlike the Klondike, where gold was hidden under layers of muck in permafrost and inland creeks, Nome offered the beach. This was a public commons where, according to the law of the time, no one could officially stake a claim below the high tide mark. This led to a surreal scene of anarchy on the sands, where thousands of men stood shoulder to shoulder, rocking their gold cradles in the surf. The economic pressure of this 18,000-strong mass created an instant hyperinflated market that rivaled San Francisco in '49, but with the added peril of an Arctic winter looming over a population with no permanent shelter and no escape once the Bering Sea froze solid.
3. Outfitting for the North, the excitement in Seattle and San Francisco. While the gold was in the frozen north, the first massive fortunes were made on the piers of Seattle and San Francisco. As the Nome excitement reached a fever pitch in the winter of 1899, these cities underwent a metamorphosis, transforming from quiet ports into frantic neon-lit gateways to the Arctic. The outfitters, merchants who sold everything from fur coats to collapsible gold rockers, became the masters of the moment. Seattle, in particular, branded itself as the gateway to the Golden North, a city where every storefront was plastered with maps of the Bering Sea, and every warehouse was bursting with tons of Alaska-proven supplies. The atmosphere in these cities was one of manic commercialism. The outfitting process was a science of survival and greed. A prospective miner could not simply buy a ticket, he had to purchase an entire outfit. A year's worth of provisions mandated by the harsh realities of the North. This included hundreds of pounds of flour, bacon, and beans, as well as specialized Arctic gear, Yukon stoves, heavy wool mackinaws, and rubber hip boots for the beach diggings. San Francisco's foundries worked through the night, casting iron parts for massive dredging machines, while Seattle's docks were choked with a bewildering variety of vessels. Everything from majestic ocean liners to rotting, condemned coffin ships that were being pressed back into service for one final desperate voyage to the Bering Sea. The economic impact on these urban centers was permanent. The capital flowing into the outfitters' coffers funded the construction of skyscrapers and the modernization of transit systems. However, there was a darker side to this excitement. The cities were also hubs for gold rush scams. Fraudulent mining companies sold shares in imaginary claims, and dishonest merchants packed barrels with sawdust instead of flour. The northbound excitement functioned as a massive wealth transfer, from the hopeful masses to the established merchant class. As the steamships, overloaded to the point of danger, pulled away from the wharves amidst cheering crowds and brass bands, Seattle and San Francisco had already mined their gold from the pockets of the departing stampeders. 4. Perils of the Arctic voyage, ice fields, and Dutch Harbor. The voyage from the temperate docks of Seattle to the golden sands of Nome was a 2,000-mile gauntlet of maritime terror. For the 18,000 stampeders of 1900, the Pacific Ocean was not a highway, but a barrier of shifting moods. Overloaded steamships, many of which were ancient hulks never intended for the fury of the North Pacific, wallowed in the troughs of massive swells, their decks crowded with shivering men and frightened livestock. As the vessels turned north toward the Aleutian chain, the air grew crystalline and bitter, and the spray from the bow began to freeze into heavy, glass-like sheets of ice that threatened to capsize the top-heavy ships. The most critical and atmospheric waypoint on this journey was Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island. This tiny emerald-green outpost in the Aleutians became a frantic, crowded bottleneck where the sea-weary travelers took their final breath of relative safety. Dutch Harbor was a scene of maritime congestion unlike any other in the world at that time. Dozens of ships, from sleek liners to rusted tugs, vied for coal and fresh water. Here, the gold fever met the reality of the elements. Miners walked the damp, foggy streets of the settlement, staring nervously at the horizon where the Pacific met the Bering Sea. They were waiting for the Bering ice to break, a seasonal event that dictated when the gateway to Nome would finally open. The true peril began once the ships cleared the Unimak Pass and entered the Bering Sea. This was a shallow, treacherous body of water where the Arctic ice pack lingered long into the spring. In May and June of 1900, a massive ice blockade trapped hundreds of vessels in a frozen waiting room. The sea was a chaotic jigsaw puzzle of white floes and deep blue leads. Ships were often nipped by the ice, their wooden hulls groaning under the immense pressure of the pack. The cost of time here was measured in gold. Every day spent trapped in the ice was a day lost to a competitor on the beach. This pressure forced captains to take suicidal risks, ramming their ships into the floes, or navigating through dense, blinding fogs where the ghostly shapes of icebergs loomed like mountain ranges. For many, the dream of gold ended not in a mine, but in a watery grave beneath the ice of the Bering Sea.
5. Dutch Harbor, the gateway to the Bering Sea goldfields. In the frantic geography of the 1900 stampede, Dutch Harbor stood as a lonely, wind-battered sentinel between the civilized world and the Arctic unknown. Nestled in a deep-water cove on Unalaska Island, this outpost became the Grand Central Station of the North. It was the last place where a man could send a telegram to his family, buy a fresh loaf of bread, or stand on solid ground before facing the unpredictable fury of the Bering Sea. During the peak of the rush, the harbor was a chaotic forest of masts and smokestacks. At any given moment, 30 to 40 vessels, from majestic steamships to leaking scows, lay at anchor, their crews and passengers gripped by a singular vibrating tension. Dutch Harbor was more than a coaling station, it was a psychological threshold. It was here that the outfits purchased in Seattle were given their final desperate audit. The air was a thick mixture of coal smoke, sea salt, and the smell of thousands of nervous men packed into steerage. It was a place of rumors and gold talk. Men huddled in the local saloons, trading whispers about the ice pack to the north. Was the Bering Sea open? Had the first ship reached Nome? Was there any beach left to stake? In this emerald green harbor, surrounded by treeless volcanic peaks, the individualistic greed of the gold seeker was sharpened by the realization that they were all competitors in a race against the elements and each other. The strategic importance of Dutch Harbor in the global gold economy of the era cannot be overstated. The harbor functioned as a metabolic valve for the gold fields. It regulated the flow of labor, food, and machinery into the north. Without the coaling wharves and sheltered waters of Dutch Harbor, the logistics of the Nome rush would have collapsed under its own weight. It was the vital link in a chain of capital that stretched from the banking houses of London to the frozen sands of Alaska. When the signal finally came that the ice had broken, the fleet would vanish from the harbor in a single night, leaving Dutch Harbor once again to the fog and the gales, its duty as the Golden Gateway fulfilled for another season.